It's time to talk about the series I'm giving up on. The reality of reading books is that not every book is gonna be great, and sometimes you're gonna read the first book in a series, and sometimes it's just not gonna hit the way you want it to. Which is why today we're going to discuss a book series I have finally decided, put my foot down on, and say, I'm not continuing. I'm sure I'm not the only one that has started the first book in a series, and I was entering this super hopeful. I was genuinely thinking, oh my god, I'm gonna find a new all-time series, and then I walk out disappointed. It's happened quite a bit. It's happened recently. It's what triggered me into making this video. So we're here to talk about it all. And if you have any book series that you've also DNF'd and you've given up on, let a girl know down in the comments. We are starting out strong, week, with the Blood and Ash series by Jennifer L. Armentrout. Now, if you guys have been longtime watchers of my channel, then you know I made a reading vlog reading the first two books, and I was very entertained. I was having a good time with them. They're not the best books out there, but at the same time, reading is a subjective experience, so to some people they are the best books out there. To me, it felt like a repetition of a lot of the popular tropes within the YA to adult genre. Some people would dare argue more on the new adult side. It didn't feel like it was doing anything wholly new. It was very predictable when I was reading it, and as I kept going, it just wasn't good. Basically, the Blood and Ash series follows our main character Poppy, who is a maiden, and she has been brought up her entire life thinking and made out to believe that she is going to play this big role in society, into the way the world works, into the ascensions of this world. And she ends up meeting one of her bodyguards, whose name is Hawk, and he ends up stirring emotions in Poppy that she should not feel because she needs to remain pure and innocent, and she's not meant to do the things she wants to do with this man. It's a fantasy series. It's got deities, it's got werewolves, it's got vampires. It seems like the total package. And yet, the more I went into this series, the more I felt like I was reading a bunch of words without any payoff. Particularly the third one, The Crown of Gilded Bones, is what actually made me put my foot down and say, I'm not continuing with this, because I read 600 pages of absolutely nothing. Everybody in that book was staring the truth and the twists right on the face. It was so obvious, and yet none of them could call it out for what it was. It was so underwhelming for such a long book, and I don't know if it was the pace in which the author was releasing these books, because she was releasing 2 books a year, or if the series was just not good from the start and I deluded myself into believing that it was, but whatever the case, it's definitely not worth it anymore. Next up, we've got the Kingdom of the Wicked series by Carrie Maniscalco. I genuinely enjoyed the first book in the series. I had a blast reading this. I personally think the first book is the perfect book to read in the fall, to read around spooky season. It is so atmospheric, and I think Carrie Maniscalco is very gifted at writing that atmosphere and setting the scene and writing sensory details, so I think that part is really nailed down in the first one. And the concept of a witch falling in love with the Prince of Hell is always something that I am down to read, and yet unfortunately it just did not hit in the second one, which is why I decided to not carry on. Now, in this one, we follow our main character Amelia after the passing of her sister, her twin sister, who is also a fellow witch, and she finds her body in a super wicked state, and she vows to find out the truth about how her sister died, why she died, exactly what happened that night, and to seek revenge on whomever was responsible for her sister's death. On the way to do that, she ends up teaming up with Wrath, who is one of the princes of hell, and the story slowly starts developing from there. It is set, I think, in the 1800s, if I'm not mistaken, and the vibes, honestly, in the first one are immaculate. I enjoyed it quite a lot, which is why I was super excited to walk into the second one, especially given how the first one ended and ended on a cliffhanger. I think the chemistry between Amelia and Wrath was very much there in that first one, and that's not to say that it wasn't present in the second one, because I definitely think it was, and it really is at this point in the series, at least in my opinion, the strongest suit of the series. However, book 2 felt similar to The Crown of Gilded Bones, where a lot of the answers seemed so obvious, and yet the main character had those realizations very late into the story, and it really did seem like the only thing going for the book was the romance. The plot surrounding it was not not nearly as interesting. And I think it had really strong elements into it that, if explored correctly, it would have made for such a compelling story. But the story just felt confused to me. Structurally, it felt confused, and the writing tone also felt confused to me. I remember at the time that the book was announced, Carrie Maniscalco had said that she was going to age up the story a little bit, and instead of it being more on the YA side, it was going to be more adult, and yet it felt even more young adult to me than the first one did, which was such an interesting reading experience. And so I fell out of love with the series. The second one was incredibly disappointing, and although part of me is still curious about Kingdom of the Feared, which is, I think, the finale of the series, I just don't know if I have the patience to get there and to get through the entire book, because I know I'm probably gonna walk out disappointed too. Next up is The Beautiful Series by Renee Ahdieh, another series that I was so excited about. I loved the first book. I was actually quite surprised at how much I enjoyed the first book. Read it in a single sitting, flew through it, and going into it, the vibes were so great. Imagine the originals, the TV show, the Vampire Diaries spin-off, set in New Orleans. You've got the witches, you've got the vampires, you've got that really dark setting, and you've got sort of the sultriness and sexiness of that time period, because it is set, again, in the 1800s. Our main character, Celine, is a dressmaker from Paris. She arrives in New Orleans, and she ends up meeting Sebastian Saint Germain, who is a vampire, but she doesn't know it, which is always a great starting point. And she finds herself in the midst of a decades-long feud between supernatural creatures. And not only that, but there is also a murder mystery. And I just think all of those elements added up made for such an amazing story in the first one. I loved the atmosphere. I loved the writing style. I found it was very beautiful. It delivered on everything I was looking for on those original vibes. However, the second book, listen, I already knew it was a risk because book one ends with one of my most hated tropes. I won't say what it is because it's a spoiler, but if you've read the series, then you know where it goes. And that is just something I am not a fan of, especially when not done correctly. And so I knew going into book two, I was taking a risk. It could have gone 50-50. Surprisingly, my issue with book two was not the trope that was used in the continuation of it. However, it was how repetitive book two was. I found that it wasn't nearly as interesting or engaging as book one. It was playing off the title a little bit too much, to the point where it was repeated every few lines, and I was like, I get it, he's damned, like, we get it, it's fine. I understood it the first time, and the second time, and the third time, and the fourth, and the fifth, and the sixth. And for a series that was sold as a paranormal romance, it ended up becoming much more fantastical in book two, which, listen, for some people, I am sure that worked for them. For me, however, I think I was looking for such a specific set of parameters, I guess you could call them, for this series in particular, that when it started bringing in other creatures, which I mean, it's not that far-fetched. If there's werewolves and witches and vampires, you kind of expect there to be even more than that, but that was not what I was looking for. And so I walked out of book two just slightly confused, because it ended up branching out on a territory that I never thought it would go to, and it just seemed like tonally the story was very different by the end of book two, which is not wholly a bad thing. I think for me, though, it was so hyper specific that I was just like, I'm out. I can't do this anymore. The Drowning Empire is another series I am not carrying on with. The first book is The Bone Shard Daughter by Andrea Stewart, and I was actually looking forward to reading this quite a lot, especially when I was first dipping my toes into adult fantasy. I'd heard that this was a great introduction into the age group and the genre. It wasn't as intimidating as other stories. The premise sounded great, and the reviews for it were quite glowing. But I grew frustrated with it quite fast. The premise of this is an empire who is ruled by an emperor who is incredibly ruthless because of a magic he has mastered, which is called bone shard magic. Now, the emperor's daughter Lynn hopes to learn enough of bone shard magic so that she can come to his level and potentially take over and save the empire from his ruthless rule. This is obviously all in the hopes of saving her people, because her father is just out of it for most of the story. Yet I couldn't myself make it through the entire story, because for a synopsis that sells you on this book being wholly about Lynn, I walked into it and I should have known at the time, but I was a beginner in adult fantasy, and I still in ways am, but I should have known this would have had multiple POVs just because of the base structure of adult fantasy. I think there's very few that don't have quite a bit of POVs, and so I walked into it expecting Lynn's POV sort of throughout everything, or third person omniscient, but following Lynn, and instead I got like 6 different POVs, all of characters that had not been named in the synopsis or in the pitch of the book. And so walking into it, I was already right off the bat thrown off at the fact that we had so many other perspectives to read from, which I think made the story so convoluted, because there was no telling at the time how all of them were interwoven into a single storyline or how they would at some point merge. It all just seemed so separate that it was taking me out of the story constantly. I also think the magic system was one of the things that I was looking forward to the most, and yet it ended up feeling super shallow and poorly explained. There was one point in the book that kept being driven into the reader as the one thing that controls the empire and it's so important, and yet nowhere in the book was it explained as to why it's so important or what exactly it was, yet we as the reader were just meant to embrace that. And maybe this book as the first installment was plainly meant to be set up for the second one. However, I would have wanted the magic system to be just a bit more fleshed out in the first one for me to fully fall into the story, instead of having to embrace things just because they exist on the page. And so it ended up being a super frustrating reading experience for me. I do wonder at times though, if I were to go back to this now, if I would enjoy it more, because I think the writing was beautiful. There were many passages that I was listening to with the audiobook or following along with the physical that I kept going, damn, that's a really good line, or that's a really good quote. But in my head as I was reading, I kept going, the book can't be as good as just one quote. There has to be more to it. But I do wonder. The Shades of Magic series by V.E. Schwab is another one I'm adding to my list. This has been on my list for quite a while actually, because I read the first book, which is A Darker Shade of Magic, and then the second one, A Gathering of Shadows. I feel like that's the second one. Read both of them, and I could not bear to get through the entire series, even if it was just 3 books. The second one was a little bit of a step up, but not enough for me to be interested to carry on. I think my biggest issue with this series really is Lila Bard and that freaking romance that was being pushed onto me as if it was freaking water that I needed to drink to survive. And I was honestly infuriated at the fact that it seemed to be such a prevalent part of the series. It was so insta-lovey in the worst way possible, which is honestly just a testament to 2013 YA writing. It used to be the standard back then, so I can't blame it too much because it is a product of its time. One of our main characters is Kel, and he is an Antari, and the Antari are a dying breed race of people who can basically hop from London to London. In the series, it is established that there are 4 different Londons with 4 different levels of magical activity. There's White London, Black London, Grey London, and Red London. And then he ends up meeting Lila Bard, who is a thief. She ends up robbing him, and then she's like, oh my god, let's go on an adventure together, and basically hops from one London to another because of Kel. And I was not there in any way, shape, or form for their relationship, for their quote-unquote chemistry, which was basically non-existent. They infuriated me to no end. Lila specifically is one of my biggest issues with this series. I found her to be so grating. Like, I genuinely did not enjoy reading her on the page. It seems like she was super conceited and spoiled in all of the worst ways. And listen, I can vibe with a character that has that personality trait. And specifically when I think of Lila, I think of other characters I have read that have gone through the sort of same life experiences, and yet they do have a nicely built character arc where you get to see their growth. And Lila had no growth. She stayed the same for 2 books, and I just didn't really like the progression of her character. And so it kept getting worse for me personally. One of the characters also that we were told we were meant to care for, which is Reese, he was so detached from the story that I could not bring myself to care about him. Even though him and his role in the story was very important, I just could not bring myself to give a single flying fuck about this man. And the plot itself over time I just found to be so forgettable and so strangely convoluted. And I've just had to embrace that V.E. Schwab is one of those authors that I'm gonna have a rocky relationship with, because some of her books are good, some of her books books are not so good, some of her books are great, and I know she can write because I've read other books by her that are really, really good, like Vicious, like The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, and yet the series, although it's so popular, was just not one that I enjoyed, to be honest. And last but not least, we've got the Twisted series by Ana Huang. Now, this is a series that blew up on TikTok. Everybody's been loving this. Everybody has been reading this. And I thought, I love me a good romance. I love me some good smut. I love me some darker themes in romance as well. And I thought this would be the great next book to read. And now I want my $4.99 back. And we follow our main character Ava, who is a college student. She is there specifically for photography, and she has a really good bond with her brother. However, her brother is going abroad to Central America. It was never said where exactly he was going, but the author kept driving. He's just going to Central America to do some work. But where? Central America is not a country, baby. So her brother's going away, and apparently she's got issues with her ex, and so because of it, her brother decides to enlist his best friend Alex, who very much doesn't like Ava, to move into his house, which is right next to Ava's, to watch over her, to basically play nanny of some kind so that she doesn't get in trouble. And so if her toxic ex shows up, she doesn't have to deal with it and Alex can kind of step in and help. This book was honestly one of the most atrocious things I've ever read. I definitely had the worst time with this book. Not only are all of the major events in this book not even on page, but the characters are so incredibly cringe. I was actually physically withdrawing from the book because I could not believe my eyes. I could not believe what I was reading because the book had so many unfunny one-liners. It was actually kind of impressive as to how many there were and how continuously bad and worse they got. Not only that, but the book had these very weird time jumps. At one point of the book, between one chapter and the next, it was mentioned that it had been 3 months and that Ava was taking swimming lessons from Alex, and it had been a really important part of their bond and why they got along so well, and we got to see none of it. And so all of their chemistry felt entirely made up by the author and not like this organic thing that is developing between the characters. The characters just didn't feel like they were alive. They felt like they were being forcefully written by the author. Not only that, but this halfway through turned into a murder mystery with some telenovela dramatic reveals that I did not enjoy. And the ex that was supposed to be the catalyst to this whole thing was barely in the book, and it seemed so over exaggerated as to why Alex had to look after her in the first place. It didn't warrant that much, and so the entire book just felt over dramatic, under-explained, incredibly cringy, and the format of the book itself was just so bad. It was honestly such a bad experience, and those are some of the series I am giving up on. It is not the entire list. However, these are the ones that jumped straight into my mind as soon as I thought about this video idea, because I genuinely thought I would love all of these and I would carry on with the series and I would read all of them and vlog them and just have a good time. And I didn't, so I think these weigh very heavy on my heart in terms of the disappointment. So I thought I'd share with you guys what those were. And again, let me know down in the comments if you've read any series that you are giving up on. Why are you giving up on it? And if you've also DNF'd any of the series I mentioned in this video, do let a girl know down in the comments. And also, I think it'd be interesting to know like what exactly makes you stop reading a series. And if you don't read a series and you're curious about how it ends, like what do? Do you look up a vlog? Do you look up like a blog review? Do you look up something spoiler related so that you can feel a sense of completion in your brain? Do let a girl know, because for some of them I would like to know how it ends. Don't forget to subscribe down below if you haven't done so already. I am constantly uploading videos that I'm sure you do not want to miss, and if you want to support the channel further, I do have a Patreon. It is always linked down below. I love you guys the most, and I shall see you on the next one. Bye!